Oke, bahagia, senyum, damai, bahagia, ya senyum. Satu, dua, tiga, empat. Jangan tapi di kamera bukan jelek. Senyum, tiga, empat. Ambil, nahan mau. Dua, tiga, empat. Bahagia, bukan senang ya, tapi bahagia. Indah, indah. Ini bukan rekayasa. Indahnya alam, indahnya alam. Oke, damai, damai, damai. Kak. Lari.
Joshua,
Roger,
look at this guy.
the Palekinski.
He's doing a lot of effort.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's talk a little bit about the art of killing and the look of silence. And then I would like to begin also talking about The End, which is your first fiction film, so to speak. Let's begin talking this way. The three films, or the two films and the last one, they assume to explore a perspective which is difficult to assume, which is the one that you have done films in which you explore the mindset, fantasy and imaginary landscape from the people who has written the story, the history, because they have won. When I mean that, it's not a question of a competition, it's a question of mass killing. Or in the fiction it's another way, but we are about to talk later. So can you talk a little bit, how do you get to the act of killing? And also, why you have chosen to go into the mind of the perpetrators in Indonesia, history, killing, massive killing in the mid-60s?
So I went first to Indonesia as a young man, 27, to work with plantation workers who were trying to make a documentary about their struggle to organize a union in the aftermath of the US-sponsored Suharto dictatorship, under which unions were illegal. And when they protested, the company hired a paramilitary group that wore bright orange camouflage, which you see at the center of the act of killing, to beat up the workers and to threaten and intimidate also us, who were there to help them make this film. And they immediately, after this happened, plantation workers immediately dropped their demand. They said, we cannot pursue this. This is too sensitive. And I said, I understand it was terrible to be attacked, but you can't simply drop this, can you? After all, this is killing half the people in this village. And the plantation workers then told me that their parents and grandparents had been killed by this same paramilitary group in the 1965 mass killings, simply for being members of the Plantation Workers Union at the time. They were accused of being communists and were killed, and they were afraid this could happen again because the paramilitary group was more powerful than ever. They were killing for the army. About why, after 35 years, we're still living in such fear. And I started by working as you would with the survivors, who were the ones who were afraid, but we immediately were arrested and our equipment confiscated and broken. But the family that was sort of at the center of organizing my meetings with the survivors, it's also the family at the center of the Look of Silence, said, don't give up. Let's talk about this at a meeting. And they called a midnight meeting. 40 survivors' families came at midnight from around that whole region and said the same thing. You can't give up. You're here. You speak the language. If you cannot film us, film the perpetrators. And that struck me as even more crazy than risking our safety and the safety of the survivors by filming the survivors. But when we did, we found that the perpetrators were boastful. And I felt that I was getting something much closer. Not only were they boastful, they were eager to take me to the places they killed, demonstrate how they killed, talk about it in front of their children and their grandchildren. And I realized that what I was getting was much closer to performance than to memory. They weren't, not to say it was lying what they were saying. I would check what they said by asking other people on their death squads who didn't know I was talking, to confirm the details, the facts. But it was much closer. There was something performative about it, and performance is always intended for an audience. And my question was, for whom are they boasting? How do they want to be seen by their wives, by their children, by me, and by, behind my camera, the world? How do they want to see themselves? And then, because it was so awful, the things that they were acknowledging and confessing to me and boasting about to me, how do they really see themselves? So this gap between how do they want to see themselves and how they really see themselves is what I wanted to explore. And that led me to down this rabbit hole of allowing them to dramatize what they did in whatever way they wish. They had a particular relationship with cinema, which meant they wanted to stage their memories in the styles of their favorite genres. And that opened up this whole question of how they make themselves and we make our world through the stories and forms of imagination, stories we tell about it, and the forms of imagination through which we imagine our world.
And Joshua, there is something in the film which is extremely important, and I think is the ethical standpoint as well as its political strength, which is, in a way, it seems to be that you say yes towards what they imagine, but there is certain kind of procedures, poetics procedures, which has the quality that you never allow that what they fantasize is completely accomplished.
Exactly.
So can you explain how was that kind of mechanism that you use, and how do you realize that that was the proper way to portray them?
Well, very simply, the camera is always mine. It's not theirs. And they're not making a film, I'm making a film. And I was quite honest with them, saying I want to understand how you want to be seen and how you really see yourself. But I don't think they necessarily thought about what that really means. So I had a sense that the things they wanted to dramatize, first of all, at the surface level, would be these artifacts of impunity that would be grotesque and absurd and would reveal the fundamental immorality and horror of this entire society's present. Not what happened in 1965, but the present in which I'm filming. But what I quickly noticed, and why I chose to follow Anwar Congo as opposed to the 40 other perpetrators, because he was the 41st perpetrator I met, why I chose to follow him as opposed to the others is there was always a pain that I think they all felt, but was really visible in his face, the way you would look for rich subtext in the face of a brilliant actor. He had this pain. He could not hide the gap between how he wanted to be seen and how he really felt about himself. And that became what I was filming. Because along with the grotesque absurdity of the artifacts of impunity that the scenes themselves that they were creating embodied, alongside that, the very fact that he could not live with himself, that it was every day was, to quote, because we were talking about this earlier, Joseph Conrad, the horror, that every day was that for him. That demolished the whole Victor's history that had made him into a hero and a kind of mascot of this regime. It just unraveled. And so that's what I was focused on, that's what the film's about.
Dalam, nggak dalam. Oh, sok berani.
After the art of killing, barely 2 years later, you did a kind of dialectical movement in the sense that the look of silence is how to perceive the whole story, in this case from the eye of the victims, but at the same time opening the possibility that victims and perpetrators, they were facing each other. So can you tell a little bit about this?
Yeah.
It's a different film in a way.
Yeah, in a way it's the negative image of the act of killing, in the sense that the act of killing has these bombastic, loud, colorful sequences that suddenly end in silence. And those cuts to silence, these silent tableaus, I was very much concerned with how do I create a haunted landscape? How do I actually put ghosts in a banal, quotidian space? And I realized that those cuts were also shifts in perspective from the perpetrators to the people who have to live in their shadow.
Yeah, there is a moment which is very clear that a mass killing is being done in a village, and everything is being reenacted, and there is a cut of the silence. Everything is in silence, So that is the way that I see the film. The fantasy is over.
And exactly. And then it cuts from that silence, it cuts into the sea.
Exactly.
And then from the sea to a shopping mall, which is its own political and economic analysis and statement. But then I felt the second film should be a kind of, we should enter any of those silent spaces that punctuate the act of killing, and in that space, stay there with a family of survivors and make a kind of poem about what silence and terror does to a family, does to a mother's love for her child, for what dementia as they grow. What does it mean to grow old and senile and to lose your memory when you've never been able to remember out loud, when you haven't been allowed to discuss what's given you trauma? And Adi, the protagonist of The Look of Silence, had watched as I was shooting the act of killing for 5 years. The 5 years that I was shooting, he would come almost every day to the house where we were living to watch whatever we had time to show him. And it changed him, and he became a kind of human rights activist as a result, looking for justice in the case of his brother's murder. And then he said at the end, and we'd always planned to make another film if we could safely. And having made the act of killing, it was safe for me to now film with the survivors because the perpetrators simply assumed I was on their side. And they knew that I had become friends with oh, watch out. They knew,
He almost died.
Yeah, he almost died.
The act of killing. There is a shift in your last film, Diane. This is the new film. 10 years later, you have done, it looks like a kind of shotgun marriage, because it is a dystopian sci-fi end of the world plus musical, which is not the typical way to conjoin two genres, so to speak, but I think it works perfectly well. At the same time that The Art of Killing begins with a musical number, and it was a documentary. So the flavor of, or the sense of musical was already. But
I always thought of The Act of Killing as a musical.
Yeah, of course. But how could you make to do, or why you have chosen a rich family? And again, it's the only surviving family in the whole world. So you have a cell living in a kind of bunker, and they look to be okay, they're not. And can you tell us a little bit this obsession, on one hand to portray people who have written again the victory or the story or the surviving story in this case, and through a musical, why this mixture and how it works? Because I think it looks like a protection, but it is not.
No, I think it's can be two things at once. I think it's about power, and power lies in the ability, the freedom to write the story, and it's about impunity. And I would say that, like the perpetrators in my other films who were mass murderers, we see in the end people who have escaped justice, just to say they live in impunity, but they've not escaped punishment. And the extremity of their wrongs, at the same time, the extremity of their sins, if you like, although I'm not a religious person, the extremity of their wrongs is a kind of allegory for all of our guilt as human beings who are complicit. Because, so there's an ambitiousness to the film which isn't in the fact that it's a musical or that it's the strange mix of genres. The ambition of the film are the three levels of allegory that exist always at all the same time. That the family is is a kind of allegory, or the household, the family, the rich family and their servants and the young woman who gets in, is a kind of allegory for the broader human family. And the family, or the characters, are nameless because they are all of us. It's an allegory for each and every one of our families. And at the same time, it's an allegory for the powerful, for for the impunity that everyone in power enjoys, and that trickles down at a more intimate level. We ultimately usually have the freedom to write our own history, to reassure ourselves and whitewash away our wrongs in our own lives. That's a power that most of us get to enjoy until the end, unless we find the courage to look honestly at ourselves. And at all three of these allegorical levels, we are talking always about all of us.
In our happily ever after, we will bask in the morning light, and these walls will echo with laughter. Together our future is bright.
Because he's a villain.
It's difficult to be in his head. And it's difficult, I wouldn't say love him, at least to understand him.
Yeah,
I
because
think in a way
like,
is what you do in your films.
Because that guy with the green hair is looked at with the classic eyes of a caricature artist who is creating a caricature villain, a cartoon villain. And I think you asked a very important question, because you're absolutely right that in the act of killing and in the look of sight, in the act of killing and in the end, the point of view is often with people who've done tremendous wrong. And at the same time, what interests me in people, the way I look at them, is always with empathy and always with a kind of warmth and always with, I just can't think of another word, with love. And that's, I neither look at people with a kind of anthropological coldness where I see them as, I don't look at people with a scientific and clinical coldness. I don't look at, and I certainly don't look at people within the, as sort of, within the kind of conventional dramaturgy where we see people as villains, as bad guys. I don't divide the world into good guys and bad guys, which means the films invite you, the end and the look of the end and the act of killing invite you to identify with these people and to see yourself in them and to see the most painful parts of yourself in them. And I think that's why these two films divide people and should divide people, because they challenge us to do something very difficult, truly difficult, not just difficult, not like they're just, I'm not talking about like the way a Godard film can be difficult. They challenge us to do something painful. And some people go to see art for that. Some people are drawn to that in art, and some people are drawn to art to escape that pain.
Yeah, I think it's just to end. It's extremely difficult because you have to find the exact distance, let's say to love or to comprehend, but at the same time not to justify it and even less to identify. My impression is that you have found a kind of aesthetics which allows to do that. And that could be very, very uncomfortable.
But maybe you're right, because there's a distance that we insist upon where the characters are suddenly, where the camera pulls away from them, if you like, and we feel suddenly we are allowing them to be alone with a horror that the camera will not embrace. So when you said we're not identify, you said even less identify. I think that's actually true, and I think that's everything that we are. I'm trying to, and of course, in the end, in the act of killing, I am the antagonist behind the camera,
Absolutely.
pushing Anwar. In The Look of Silence, it's me and Adi, but especially Adi, together. In the end, it's the girl. So it's not that the end is just a collection
Not at
of
all.
wrongdoers. There's someone who comes in who is truly offering the gift of
As it's
truth.
been seen in the film, she creates the imbalance.
Absolutely, and she offers the key to salvation for all of them, but especially for Sun, and they cannot accept this gift.